We're going to talk about bias in the media. So the world is full of bias about our perception of the world. This is a fact. Do you have biases about something? Do I have biases? Well, of course I have. Of course we have. But how do our prejudice affect our perception of the media? Do the media use bias as elements of the narrative on which they build and deconstruct the stories? How much are prejudice and stereotypes used by the media to determine the factors of newsworthiness? And how far is it possible to hide part of the narrative linked to the political conflicts, social wars, deportations, death sentences, or also to bend it on the demands of the political international agenda? Those are some questions. So in 20 years of work, first covering crime and mafia in Sicily, and after other 10 nice years in the Middle East covering regional conflicts and linked to the most various tensions of the area and to the most various reasons like economic reasons, cultural, religious, ethnic, sectarian. Okay, I can say that bias in the work reporting conflict areas plays a decisive role, really a decisive role in the choice of newsworthiness and the information of public opinion. In the formation of public opinion, I want to underline this. There's a recent academic work of the American Press Institute. This work reflects the fact that the bias cannot be excluded from journalism. It's not possible to exclude it from journalism. So the job of journalists is not to stamp out bias. Rather, the journalist should learn how to manage it. And to do that, the journalist needs to become conscious of the biases at play in a given story and decide when they are appropriate and maybe useful, and when they are inappropriate. Biases that journalists and their audiences probably consider appropriate are such things as a belief in representative government, open government, and social equality. Yet an unquestioning adherence to policies based on these principles might not always be the best thing. Is democracy, for example, the best form of government for all people in all places at all times? Should government not be allowed to have any secrets? We talk about transparency. How far should government go to promote social equality? So, there are also biases that cut both ways. For example, being a crusader against social ills in general is good, it's generally good, but you can lose the perspective sometimes. A bias toward official voices is necessary, but if it leaves out other voices, it's a problem. Being sensitive to sources is part of the listening well, but it can also mean that the journalist is writing for them, rather than the public could be. And looking for extraordinary stories, like the famous The Man Bites Dog story, can also lead the journalist to distort what is really going on or what is important. Another topic is the subject. For example, there is a bias built into the way journalists pick and cover stories. Certain subjects are routinely covered or ignored. Do some subjects or communities only appear when a crime occurs or when there is a special event or parade? Maybe yes.
And another topic is very sensitive, the boss. What stories have been done or overdone in order to please the boss? Well, a lot. Production is another topic. What stories are automatic because they are easy to do, but may be trivial or incremental? Or how often does the journalist call certain sources because they know the source will answer their phone or offer a perfect quote? Well, a lot. And against companies, turning skepticism into negativity and assumption that every big and successful institution must be doing something wrong. Those are the main kind of biases, but there are ones every journalist will recognize immediately. Market-oriented bias. This can be a pressure to produce stories that target market segments with desirable demographics for advertisers. Some infographics, for example. Covering the bases. This means doing the stories everyone else is going to have in order to cover bases. The same story, all the newspapers they have. Balance. Balance is a long-honored notion and can be a useful technique for a story that you may not know much about. But how many sides does it take to balance a story? How many? Is a balanced story fair? Is it true to the facts? Should you still give it equal space or weight to all sides? The last one, political bias. Another one, very sensitive, like the one about the boss. Political bias is something journalists hear a lot about from the public, but inside the newsroom, it's less topic of conversation. No one speaks about political bias regarding himself or herself. Journalists don't ask and don't tell. They don't know each other's politics. So therefore, it isn't a problem. But is that enough? Does not talking about something mean it isn't a problem? It's a problem, it is. And last but not least, there's another sort of bias worth mentioning too. This is used to be called pack journalism. What is pack journalism? It's also been called groupthink. It is a storyline that the press corps in a massive way, and that everyone telling or repeating. Like a modern term is master narrative, the master narrative. For example, there's a master narrative about Bush went to state. Bush was a strong leader, or it was done, master narrative. So, these master narratives can become a kind of trap in media. The journalist picks facts that illustrate master narrative or current stereotype and ignores other facts. They ignore other facts. So, in the end, making choices requires a journalist to think. A journalist needs to be conscious, exactly conscious of biases, so he or she can know what biases make it into stories. There's a chapter about bias in Middle Eastern narrative. It's a very good chapter. At the beginning was Edward Said. It was the first one to talk about bias in the narrative about this media. Said was a Palestinian author. He lived in the United States, and he wrote 2 essays which we can consider milestones regarding the issue of bias in media about the Middle East. The first one is Orientalism, and it was published in 1978, and the other one was Covering Islam, published in 1996. Said died in 2003, so just after the 9/11. And, well, in 1996, so long time before, not so long time, but before the 9/11. Said shows that the Western media consider Islam as a kind of scapegoat for everything unpleasant that happens in the new political, social, and economic world. For the right parties, he said, Islam is barbarism. For moderates, it's like exotic, kind of exoticism. The exception is the left parties, which often expose a few Islamic anti-Zionist positions, denying much evidence, especially with respect to the Palestinian issue. The latter position is absolutely groundless and is not reciprocal if we consider that Islam doesn't like Marxists, doesn't like communists, doesn't like philosophies who are based on the denial of God and has indeed followed. In addition, the right party and the moderate Western party appreciate the anti-communism of Islam, with the added irony that anti-communism in the Islamic world has also been synonymous of repressive anti-American regimes, as is the case of Pakistan, the regime of Zia Allah. So the Said reflection is based primarily on the experience of the Iranian Revolution in 1979 and the incident recently commemorating the movie Argo. I don't know how many of you watched Argo, involving 2 Americans held captive for 44 days in the US Embassy in Tehran. The assumption is that in order to circumvent the temptation of more liberal Western democracy to be transparent to the core, as happened in Vietnam, thanks to the work of many reporters and the press, a necessity should be instilled in Americans to educate them about the possibility of military intervention in the Middle East because of the tragedy in Vietnam threatened to fuel pacifism and isolation at home. Those are the words of George Ball in the New York Times, published on the 28th of June 1970. All of this happened when, in an historical moment for US, in which US lost China, Vietnam, Angola, and Iran. A very sensitive moment for politics of this. So, even then, the use of prejudgments in the media was evident through the use of certain words. That's what Said said. Words that served to direct public opinion at the time, but we have other words in our times. These words are Islam, nation, democracy, Christianity. So, these words applied to geopolitics are the result of agreements, convention, historical processes of the human wish to give those ideas a recognizable identity. In particular, even then, Said stressed that Islam in the media was an object without a history, or if we consider its historical past, it was considered irrelevant or the result of continuous repetition since violence, fanaticism, despotisms that seems to occur more than once over time in the Middle East, as if they were a timeless constant.
So, if Said were to rewrite his book today covering Islam, this is my question, and it's the question that I'm asking you. Which words would he focus on? In other words, talking to the Western media, which are the empty shells which immediately resonate with the meaning and guide public opinion towards a precise reading of the facts of international news? Well, in my opinion, the words used to transfer bias in the media in the narrative of Middle East right now are, again, Islam, terrorism, fundamentalism, sectarianism, jihad, Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Qaeda, and most recently, Islamic as adjective associated with the word state. To arrive at this point, the new media language has been influenced by the following historical facts. 9/11, the collapse of the Twin Towers, the attack to the Twin Towers, the Second World War, the Second Gulf War, with Iraq, the US intervention in Iraq and Afghanistan, a long series of attacks by Al-Qaeda in a lot of places in the world, from London to Mumbai, the strong waves of immigration to Europe, the Balkan conflict, and recently the so-called Arab Springs, most recently the so-called Arab Winters, and recently the civil war in Libya, now the Syrian conflict, the current Balkanization of Iraq. What prejudice therefore underlie the wars that I mentioned? Now I go word by word. The first one, Islam. In the media prevails like a contrast between moderate Islam and radical Islam. Well, moderate Islam in reality doesn't exist. In the sense there exists a defined radical political Islam that comes from a Wahhabi point of view and after Salafi type of Islam. And this one is considered by traditional Islam a kind of haram, which means wrong and also ignorant, and it's like crystallized in a literal interpretation of the Quran. It's true that for political reasons, political Islam has quickly taken hold in many communities in the East and the West, but you cannot identify Islam simply with the Sunni Salafi Islam, which is open to the urgency of the armed struggle. That's the problem. The second war, terrorism. Terrorism nowadays is bluntly Islamic. Who, when thinking of terrorists, thinks of the Basques, the Irish, the Kurds of the PKK, the separatists, the national movements, fascists, Nazi squads? Nobody. Nobody. The third word, fundamentalism. Also fundamentalism in media now. This is always Islamic. Christian fundamentalism will never be called this, even when it becomes ideological basis of forms of terrorism. I'll give you an example. The executioner of Utoye, who killed a dozen of young people in the summer of 2013 near Stockholm, was never called fundamentalist. Indeed, an Italian newspaper took it for granted at the time that the author of the attack was Muslim and headlined its front page with a kind of, this was the headline, "With Islam doing good does not pay." Fundamentalism in media cannot even be secular. No one would dream of using this name with the Charlie Hebdo cartoonist, for example, who, with the right to satire, also masked a form of obsession, desecration for everything that has to do with religion, not only in terms of hierarchies, but also creed and theology. And no one today would call Stalin fundamentalist, yet his was a secular fundamentalism that sent every political opponent and anyone who was not an atheist to the Gulag. So there are some problems in media. Another word, Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is everything to the media. I mean, this name will resolve the most complex actions of claim and paradoxically even stifles other terrorist groups claiming their regional identity of their independence from Al-Qaeda. It's not uncommon, for example, for the followers of Haqqani in Afghanistan, which is a completely different group, to be defined as Al-Qaeda, but they are not. They are very proud to not be Al-Qaeda. The same for Mottaq al-Assad group in Iraq, that responds to the Shia wing national self-determination from American influence. And this one doesn't make sense, actually. Until recently, this was also true for what in Arabic we call Daesh. In Arabic is Dawla al-Islamiyya fi Iraq wal-Sham, that you translate as the Islamic State of Iraq and the Greater Syria or the Levant. Founded in 2004 by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and separated from Al-Qaeda in 2005. Well, today, what we call ISIS, the so-called ISIS or Daesh, has become the new brand of the terror and has replaced Al-Qaeda in the narrative of the phenomenology of Islamic terrorism. Then another word is Muslim Brotherhood. Here we're dealing with a case of media dumbing down. Even before the massacre at Rabaa al-Adawiyah in August 2013, all groups belonging to the galaxy of support of Morsi, the former Egyptian president, were called Muslim Brotherhood. Muslim Brotherhood for media at the time were a lot of people, completely different, members of the Al-Nur Party, Salafis, supporter Morsi, the bull entourage of Morsi, the true Muslim Brotherhood, and some former, what we call Al-Hazarist, which is a school, a religious school. And there are other three words that we use, all three together in general, and there are sectarianism associated with Sunni and Shia. The logic of good and bad in the movies, when you have the hero and the point of the hero, or in the football match, prevails in this word, sectarianism. It arises from prejudice instilled in the public that conflicts in these areas are primarily religious conflicts and concern the real everyday life of people, which is exactly not. The identification of a separation as fully and solely Arabic problem is wrong. There is no denying the great fracture, the separation, what we call the fitna between Sunni and Shia sectarianism, but sectarianism is used when there is no wish to explain that these are power struggles between elites, conflicts that may develop within areas of national development, but which are eminently macro-regional. And it's the classic case of the contrast between Iran and Saudi Arabia at the root of the current conflict in Yemen. Last but not least, we have jihad. It's a word of terror in general in the media, but identified with a crusade against infidels, jihad is instead one of the pillars of Islam for both Sunni and Shia. Jihad means internal struggle on the path to God, to Allah. Means that you ask to God to help you to don't make sins, to be better than you are, because you are human, so you are weak. And jihad, this word, appears 41 times in the Quran, and often idiomatic expression, effort on the path to God, what they call al-jihad fi sabilillah. So a person engaged in jihad is called a mujahid. The plural is mujahideen, so everybody are mujahideen because they struggle with themselves. And this is an important religious duty for Muslims. And a minority among the Sunni scholars sometimes refer to this duty as the sixth pillar of Islam, though it occupies no such official status. So, if possible, the overall picture is even blacker than you might imagine, and changes and moves the axis of the issues put on the table by Edward Said at the time in the late 90s to a strengthening of the phenomenon of bias. Finally, while the Western left continues to concern itself within a disproportionate way with the Palestinian issue, the Arabs themselves to turn it upside down. This is interesting. Not a few Arabs, the Iraqis, for example, are no longer united over the Palestinian issue because they have understood the scope instrumental in many regimes to push their nations to war. For example, is the case of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And the Syrian issue and currently the Yemeni conflict are further dividing the Arabs, and they are moving away from the Israeli-Palestinian issue. So it should be said that not only the Western media lives with bias. That's something interesting. When we talk about biased media, we think about our media, Western media, but there are other medias. And it would be necessary to write a twin book to covering Islam by Edward Said with a broad vision of Arab and pan-Arab media, a kind of covering the West, to understand how the media use prejudices, they use biases to determine the vision of the West by Middle Eastern citizens. That's very important. From that side, the key words are some words that maybe you don't expect to have. Secularism, that's not Christianity at all. Imperialism, Zionism, that's of course, crusade, and impurity related to the freedom we have. In this specific case, prejudices are always functional to propaganda, but are also required to the survival of the journalist, who often pay with their lives for a critical stand. And they pay, first of all, towards the elite in power, the dictatorships, then to the terrorist groups. And remember that the countries with the highest number of employees in the local media, I mean cameramen or bloggers or journalists and so on, killed and or missing are Iraq, Syria, and Egypt. I'm talking about local journalists, not Western journalists that go there. So the final question is, therefore, is bias necessary and essential to the narrative in the media of the Middle East? The answer, I'm sorry to say this, is yes. Yes, because they are currently functional to a hypothetical clash of civilizations, triggered by the political agendas of both sides. But with one major difference. In the West, bias can still be a matter of style of the journalist, or a choice, or a point of view, and its use is therefore even more deplorable to the extent that the Western media are based on objectivity, on their role as watchdog of power, or on investigation, on equidistance. In the Middle East, due to a lower level of freedom of the press and freedom of expression, as well as real literacy not being widespread, and because of a nepotism in political participation, sometimes bias becomes a forced choice. It's a forced choice. It has dramatic and fatal consequences, but paradoxically, compared to the instruments of choice and knowledge that we have, it's less to blame. Thank you all for your attention.